Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Japan Station.
Welcome to Japan Station, a production of japankyo.com. This is the show where we talk about all things Japan. I'm your host, japankyo.com founder, content creator, and all-around Japan nerd, Tony R. Vega. Here's a quick announcement before we get into the main part of the episode. I was just interviewed over on the Just Japan podcast by Kevin O'Shea. The Just Japan podcast is probably the longest running Japan-focused podcast that is still around. It's a great show. I always enjoy talking to Kevin. This was the second time that he invited me on the show. Always an honor. This time we talked about my recent walk across Japan from Kyoto to Yamaguchi Prefecture, around 400 kilometers. I'm legally blind, so a lot of crazy stuff happened during the journey, and I talk about it in the latest episode of Just Japan. The link will be down below. Go check it out. And of course, subscribe to his show as well if you haven't already, which I think you probably already are because he's my senpai. If you know about Japan Station, I'm sure you know about the Just Japan podcast as well. But just in case, hit that subscribe button as well. Anyway, let's get into the episode today. So my guest today is a returning one. Actually, it's his third time on the show. The past two appearances were amazing as well. Links will be down below. But my guest today is Dr. Robert D. Eldridge. He is an expert on U.S.-Japan relations, political history, and diplomatic relations. This time around, we're going to be talking about the Senkaku Islands. This is a topic that comes up pretty regularly on the news. It's something that I was very aware of and had a general understanding of. It's a very important topic, but just like me, I'm sure there's a lot of you that don't know all of the history behind this. So the very, very short version of this is that these are islands that belong to Japan. If you look at the records, they belong to Japan, but China wants them very badly. And every so often they come up in the news because they do something that, well, basically says like, hey, these islands are actually ours and you better get out of here. So again, there's a long history here and it's something that I wasn't too aware of, but Dr. Eldridge explains everything. This is super, super interesting. And from now on, if this topic ever comes up in conversation with me, like I run into somebody that for some reason asked me about the Senkaku Islands, I'm going to tell them, listen to this episode because Dr. Eldridge breaks it down in such an easy to understand way and really gives the important historical context necessary to understand why this is an important issue and why things are the way they are. So I think you're going to find this really, really fascinating and it's going to really enlighten you about this topic because often in the news, they don't really give all of the important historical background. So here we go. Hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Dr. Robert D. Eldridge. Welcome back. It's your third time. It's the hat trick.
Thank you. Yeah.
But it's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. And every time I'm left thinking, there's so much more we could talk about. So today we're talking about the Senkakus, and this is something that I've never brought up on the show, but it's a really important topic, and I'm glad I can talk to somebody who can really teach us about it and tell us, why it's such an important topic. So could you for anybody that's unaware, what are the Senkakus? Like, what can you tell us? Not just where they are, but like kind of what's important about them.
Right. Well, thank you for having me on the show again. Yeah, there are so many things we could talk about, and even this topic, the Senkaku Islands, could go on for hours.
Yeah.
And it's an issue that has really challenged Japan's relations with two of its neighbors, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, which also claims the islands, as well as Taiwan or the Republic of China, which claims the islands. So three countries, and I believe I look at Taiwan as a country. So the three countries, including Japan, have had a lot of political, diplomatic tensions over the islands at certain junctures in the past. And they are uninhabited islands. There are 5 islands, and their names are Uotsuri, Kita Kojima, Minami Kojima, Kubajima, and Taishojima. And so they're uninhabited now, but in the pre-war period, when a Japanese businessman and developer had an enterprise on the islands, there were as many as 240 people that were living there at one point. So the islands can sustain human life. If they could in the old days, the pre-war period, they can certainly sustain life today with all the various technologies that we have. But in part, not to rile up tensions, Japan is not redeveloped or re-inhabited the islands, and currently they do not have a government presence in the islands. So they don't have any police or any government officials on the island, and they don't have any occupied bases facilities on the islands. And the Japan acquired the islands back in 1895. They annexed them. They were uninhabited islands prior to that period. No country really claimed them. But starting in the 1880s, the Japanese businessman that I mentioned earlier, Mr. Koga Tatsushiro, who was from a place called Yame in Fukuoka Prefecture, he
famous for tea. Yame,
sorry?
Yame-cha.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're famous
Um,
for tea, but that's totally irrelevant to
right,
the story. Sorry.
right. No, exactly. So, with that entrepreneurial spirit, he moved to Okinawa Island proper, Okinawa, and then set up a business there. And then the business was so successful that he decided to set up a second shop in Ishigaki. And Ishigaki is the closest, large island to the Senkaku Islands themselves. And so historically, fishermen would travel from Ishigaki, in some cases from Miyako Island too, to fish in the Senkaku's area. And they would bring back stories about, what was on the islands, birds and bird dung, eggs, all sorts of things. And eventually, this Mr. Kolga decided to, do a survey of the island and thought he could monetize some of the things on the island. So he applied to the prefecture of Okinawa leadership, and then eventually to the Japanese government, the central government, to be allowed to develop the island. Initially, the Japanese government hesitated because they weren't terribly familiar with the islands, but eventually, a decade later, they gave that permission. And so basically from 1895, when Japan annexed the islands, they then allowed this individual to develop the islands. And that essentially continued until 1940, with people going back and forth between the islands and Ishigaki. But with the clouds of war, pending war happening,
Right.
fuel prices became expensive. And so it became more and more difficult to sustain people out on the Senkakus. So essentially from 1940 onwards, no one lived on the islands. And then at the end of World War II, uh, the U.S. came into control of the Nansei Island chain, which includes Okinawa, includes the Senkakus, and the U.S. Controlled the Senkakus as part of the occupation and administration of the Nansei Islands, and that administration ended in May 1972 when the United States returned Okinawa to include the Senkaku Islands to Japan. And at that time, the U.S. Returned administrative rights, essentially all rights over Okinawa and the Senkakus to Japan. However,
Mm.
at that time, the U.S. Took a sort of a neutral attitude on the territorial claims to the Senkakus.
Hmm.
And prior to that, prior to 1972, so technically it was 1971 when the Okinawa Reversion Agreement was hammered out between the United States and the Japanese government. Prior to that time, so the 77 years prior to that, from 1895 to 1972, the US government never doubted Japanese sovereignty to the islands. And in fact, during the occupation and administration of the Senkakus, or Okinawa, including the Senkakus, the U.S. went out of its way to demonstrate that the islands, actually belonged to Japan.
Mm.
And in 1951, in September, at the time of the San Francisco Peace Treaty Conference, the architect of the peace treaty, John Foster Dulles, who served as a special ambassador in charge of negotiating the peace treaty, he made clear that the Nansei Islands, so Okinawa, in fact, belonged to Japan. The U.S. was going to administer the islands, have all rights over the islands, but the residual sovereignty over the islands belonged to Japan. And the Senkakus were included in that administration. So therefore, the U.S. Recognized Japan's sovereignty over the Senkakus.
Mm.
However, in 1971, when the reversion agreement was being negotiated, as I mentioned before, the U.S. started to distance itself from Japan's claims or sovereignty to the islands. And that was done for a couple of reasons. And we can get into that later if you have any questions up until this point.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, no, I mean that history really helps because like the Senkakus is something that pops up in the news in Japan. Like I don't know, every year or two or three. I don't know, pretty regularly. It's like something you hear about something, but you don't really understand all of the history. So thank you for clearing that up. But okay, so let's get into the reason. What is then the what was the change in the stance, right? If it seems like, well, going back to the 1800s, it was clear that this was part of Japan, and then the U.S. says, okay, now take over, it's yours. It was always yours, but we're leaving it up to you now. Like, where did that ambiguity come in then?
Right. So the Okinawa Reversion Agreement was negotiated in the final aspects of the agreement were negotiated in June 1971. That was during the Nixon administration.
Hmm.
And Nixon and his national security advisor, Kissinger, were very interested in opening relations with China,
Yeah.
the PRC.
Right.
And uh, some of your viewers and you yourself may recall or be aware that in July 1971, there was a huge surprise diplomatically that was announced, and that was that President Nixon was going to be visiting uh, the PRC
Right.
in February the following year. So, in other words, in 1972. Those discussions, those secret discussions, so Kissinger feigned an illness while he was visiting Pakistan to secretly travel to Beijing, to uh, Peking at the time, to have those secret discussions. Um, the announcement and the negotiations were essentially made simultaneously as the reversion agreement with Okinawa was being worked out. So Nixon and Kissinger had their eyes on China, but they were negotiating with Japan over the return of Okinawa. And by this point, 1971, both the PRC and Taiwan, the Republic of China, were both stepping up their statements and claims to the Senkakus,
Hmm.
which they really hadn't done before. The reason they started doing that was in the late 1960s. In 1968, there was a committee within the United Nations that did a survey of resources, natural resources that were in the area. It's called the ACAF study. That was published in 1969. And in that study, it was announced that there was the potential for billions of dollars worth of natural resources in the seabed in the vicinity of the Senkaku Islands.
Okay.
So all of a sudden, uh, the Republic of China and the PRC became interested in these islands. Until that time, they weren't. And historically, they basically recognized that the islands were part of Japan. There's another dynamic involved. Uh, so at the time, so this is still June of 1971, before in the United Nations, the debate over who actually represented China at the time. The ROC, the Republic of China, still represented China within the United Nations. In the fall that year, the PRC was able to have the recognition of who represented China switch to the PRC.
Mhm.
And so within ROC, PRC dynamics, there was pressure and competition between them to see who actually represented the interests of China. So therefore, neither country could allow Japan to, to receive the Senkakus again,
Mhm.
because that would give the appearance of surrendering territory to Japan, which neither of them, Chiang Kai-shek's ROC, as well as Mao Zedong's China, would be willing to do. And so there was an escalation of claims, and then there was a sort of like a one-upmanship between the ROC and the PRC.
Mhm.
So this is going full blast as the negotiations over the return of Okinawa are taking place. The ROC Taiwan was still a formal ally of the United States. Japan was a formal ally of the United States as it is today. And the US was placed in a very difficult situation where two of its allies were making territorial claims to the same area.
Mm.
And so the US on the one hand, wanted to develop relations with the PRC. So that was motivation number one, about why it took a neutral stance. Motivation two, or reason number two, was that uh, the ROC was making claims to another ally's territory. And so the US decided to kind of pull back at that time. In 2014, I published a book called The Origins of US Policy in the East China Sea Islands Dispute. Very long name. I didn't choose that title, so don't blame me. The publisher did.
It's a
Um,
very searchable title.
if you can remember it, I can't
Yeah.
even remember the
No, I mean,
title.
like, that is exactly the kind, like, if you want to find out about that, that's what you would put into Google, right?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe that's what they were thinking.
I guess so,
Um,
huh?
yeah, this to me, the subtitle is better.
Yeah.
It's the Senkaku Islands and Okinawa's reversion,
Yeah. Yeah.
or the reversion of Okinawa, something like that. But um, so in that book, I go into excruciating detail about the negotiations and the history of the Senkakus
Mhm.
and explain what happened at that time. It's really the first time in English for an English book to go into uh, that level of detail. I tried to interview everyone that I could that was involved at the time, and was fortunate enough to have been able to do that, with the exception of Kissinger. Um, and I did approach him. Unfortunately, he
He feigned
wasn't.
an illness again.
Uh, he
Not this
wasn't
time.
forth. Yeah, he wasn't forthcoming.
Sure, sure,
Um,
sure. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, and I think one person criticized me for not interviewing Nixon, but Nixon was dead by this point for 20 years, and there's no way. I'm a good researcher, but I'm not going to go into somebody's coffin uh,
Yeah.
to wake
What a
them. But,
criticism. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but so there was intense pressure on the Nixon administration, um, to you know to you know to negotiate this. And at the time, uh, between Japan and the United States, with the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, there was a sort of a secret agreement that took place. And that was an agreement between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon in November 1969. So Nixon really wanted the Okinawa Reversion. President Nixon wanted um, a he wanted relief on textiles that were being exported to the United States. So in the 1968 presidential election, he he promised the southern states, particularly like South Carolina, which had a strong textile industry, that if they switched to support the Republicans, um, in other words, him, that he would make sure to get relief from the import of textiles. So he basically put pressure on Sato to stop exporting so much. So voluntary export restraints on textiles to the U.S. At the time, there was a six-party negotiation that was going on with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Thailand, um, other countries, I think the Philippines too, to uh, to not export textiles to the U.S. So the person in charge of those negotiations, his name was David Kennedy. He put pressure on Nixon. He said, um, if you give the Senkakus to Taiwan, the Senkaku or Taiwan will cooperate on the textiles. Um, and even Nixon, who was the ultimate wheeler and dealer, he said that would be way too much. Japan would have a fit.
Hmm.
So rather than giving the Senkakus to Taiwan, or rather than separating the Senkakus from the reversion of Okinawa and buying more time, Nixon allowed Japan to have administrative rights over the Senkakus in Okinawa, but the U.S. wouldn't go so far as to actually recognize Japanese sovereignty once again.
Hmm.
The Japanese government really tried hard at the time to get the U.S. to recognize Japanese sovereignty. They did, I think, as much as they could against a much stronger, you know, partner, uh, and they weren't successful in getting uh, Japanese claims or Japanese sovereignty recognized by the U.S. again, but they did basically everything in their power. And also, uh, they kind of related to the security treaty, the U.S.-Japan security treaty, and Article 5 is said to apply to the Senkakus. And there's a discussion about that, a debate about that, um, but in publicly it does apply. So that's where some Japanese have gotten satisfaction that the U.S. essentially recognizes that the Senkakus belong to Japan.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Well, I didn't understand the whole dynamic with Taiwan and China that was going on at the time. That's something that I had heard about, like it being under ownership, but and then the whole, like, it used to be inhabited. I had a general idea of that, but I had no idea about the Taiwan thing. So that was very interesting and very much of the time, Nixon time, and the whole trying to open up those relationships that yeah, had gone over my head. But so from there, then does that play into that directly connects with your article that was just published in the Japan Times, right? With the
Mhm.
whole, the U.S. should restart the firing range, right? That's at the core of that article, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So in mid-December, so I guess December 11th
Mm-hmm.
or so, um, in the Japan Times, I published the op-ed, the commentary that the U.S. should uh, restart its use of the two ranges, the essentially air to ground. Uh, so airplanes, bombing or you know, uh, shooting at uh, two islands that are ranges, facilities in the Senkakus. The two islands are Kubajima and Taishojima, and they are the uh, the farthest removed from the from the within the group of five islands. And Kubajima is also known as Kobisho. So um, in the Status Forces Agreement and the designation of facilities that is related to the Status Forces Agreement, uh, the the island is called Kobisho,
Mm-hmm.
and that island was used by the U.S. Air Force and then later the U.S. Navy from 1948. And then in 1956, the second island, Taishojima, which is called Sekibisho in the agreements, started being used. So roughly for 30 years with Kubajima and 20 years with Taishojima, the U.S. was using those for aerial ranges. Beginning in 1978, 6 years after the Okinawa reversion, and in 1972, when Okinawa was reverted, U.S. bases that were in Okinawa to include um, the bombing ranges within the territorial waters of Okinawa were uh, the Japanese government allowed the U.S. to continue using those through the SOFA, the Status Forces Agreement. The U.S. continued using them. And then in 1978, the U.S. State Department made a decision not to use them. And the reason that it made that decision was in April 1978, China sent a lot of fishing vessels, basically swarmed the Senkaku Islands um, with about 200 different fishing vessels.
Hmm.
There are a number of explanations why they did that. Um, but one of the explanations is that they wanted to assert their sovereignty uh, and create like a fait accompli in that area. Prior to then, so from 72 uh, to 78, both Taiwan and the PRC were generally quiet about the Senkakus. Japan, too, was generally quiet about the Senkakus. It did nothing after 1972 to fortify the islands. So they didn't put an SDF base, a self-defense force base, on the island. They didn't put any government officials. So, for example, like a uh, environmental, uh, you know, agency representative or a police agency representative or a, Ministry of, contemporary land, transportation and industry representative. They didn't rebuild uh, there's like a small port there that was used in the pre-war. They didn't do anything to create a port where fishing vessels could flee to in bad weather.
Hmm.
They didn't uh, put in a lighthouse or a weather station, which had been talked about previously. They didn't put an airport in or a heliport in, which generally most of the outer islands would have, that the larger outer islands. So Japan didn't do anything to truly demonstrate that it had administrative rights over the islands.
Hmm.
Um, Perhaps because it didn't really want to inflame tensions whatsoever.
Sure.
To me, that was a very short-sighted decision because it sort of made the claims by Taiwan, the ROC, and the PRC, it gave them a sense of legitimacy,
Hmm.
I think, because Japan didn't demonstrate that it was actually in an effective control over the islands. So in 78, China sent all these fishing vessels there, and the US at the time was in the middle of negotiations about formally recognizing the PRC and establishing diplomatic relations with them and ending diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with the ROC, which was one of the conditions that the PRC made. These talks between the U.S. and China, the PRC, were kind of stalled. China was in the middle of its still at the tail end of its cultural revolution, and there were domestic matters that had to be worked out within China, different factions. So discussions were stalled. The State Department wasn't making too much progress, and so the National Security Advisor Brzezinski um, went to China, and uh, my my sense is that he was really gung ho uh, about pursuing relations with China, trying to sort of be like a Kissinger almost. And so the effort in 1971 for the U.S. to move forward with, developing relations with China, that same dynamic seems to have played out in 1978 when the U.S. decided um, to um, to stop using the Senkaku ranges, even though they were guaranteed by the SOFA, because it was afraid of getting entangled in the so-called dispute between the PRC and Japan, and to a lesser extent the ROC. So basically, the U.S. Kind of gave up its rights to those two very important ranges that have been used for 30 and 20 years respectively, out of fear of kind of either antagonizing China or getting entangled in the issue. So for the past 45 years, the US hasn't used the ranges.
Mm-hmm.
And in my 2014 book that I mentioned before, I had a suspicion that it was either the State Department, because of its, efforts to have close relations with China, or possibly the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which often is timid in its interactions with China. It was one of those two that probably made that decision, that unilateral decision,
Mm-hmm.
um, or that I should say that decision not to use the ranges. In 2021, the Japanese news agency, Kyodo News Agency, um, published the declassified documents about that decision. It didn't declassify, or it didn't publish everything, but it published a couple of key documents. And in it, it made clear that it was the State Department that unilaterally made that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they uh, they shared that information with the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs was upset, but it was a unilateral decision by the U.S. My article built on that earlier article by Kyodo. I went to Washington, D.C. This fall, and did a lot of archival research, and also did interviews with people that were involved in the decision at the time. And my argument in the commentary is that because of the um, efforts over the past 50 years of the PRC to undermine Japan's um, administrative rights over the islands, and the silliness of the U.S. uh, not using important ranges that are guaranteed by the SOFA, and the dangerous precedent that established, by which China, um, by saying something or making claims, would make it difficult for the U.S. to use the facilities that are guaranteed by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. That dangerous precedent needs to be ended, and the U.S. should restart using those ranges, particularly as China conducts exercises in the region, just as we speak right now. And every day, China sends ships to the area around the Senkakus. It's government ships, so it's Coast Guard, coastal police ships.
Mm-hmm.
And so every day it's been chipping for years. It's been chipping away at Japanese administrative rights. So, so I think the time now is important that we reestablish that use. And why did I publish it in December? Is because of the worsening situation in the region, plus the fact that the last time the U.S. military used those ranges was December 15th, 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in middle of December right now. So I thought the timing was important.
Right. And then January, I think you mentioned January was like the Senkaku Day. There, um,
Correct. Yeah, January 14th is the anniversary
mhm,
of the development of the Senkaku Islands by Mr. Koga in the
right.
1880s, technically 1890s.
Hmm.
And that national or that Senkaku's Development Day
Hmm.
was established in 2012.
Hmm. Hmm. And what day is that? You remember?
So that would have been, I think, the day that that this Mr. Koga
Mhm.
uh, either traveled to the Senkakus or landed there.
Oh, okay, okay. And
And so that
January
day's
12th?
January 4th.
14th,
Uh,
14th.
yeah,
Okay.
but they started it in 2012 in Ishigaki.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
And
Gotcha.
there's a memorial to the development of the Senkakus. And the ceremony is there's a small ceremony that's done at the memorial, and then there's a larger event done at one of the city facilities in Ishigaki. So I've been there to that ceremony a couple times in the past.
Oh, okay. In the article, like you just mentioned, you lay out the U.S. should restart the firing ranges, and that would, basically kind of reaffirm, this is Japan's territory, and make a statement and all that. But what do you think though? Like, because if they haven't done that by now, do you think there's a chance that that will happen? Of course, we have the Trump administration starting the second administration coming and all that, so there's a lot we can't predict. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I do think certainly with an incoming Trump administration,
Hmm.
they will do it. Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm leaving hope that the current Biden administration uh, will do it too.
Hmm.
Now that they're aware of the situation,
Hmm.
um, the U.S. government quite often tends to be filled with people who have no geographical and cultural understanding of the countries that they their policies affect.
Hmm.
And I know for a fact that officials in Washington, D.C., including those that um, are most identified with being, the most knowledgeable about Japan, have no clue about the history of the Senkakus.
Hmm.
I had a heated discussion with one of those individuals 4 years ago,
Hmm.
uh, and he served as the head of the Japan desk on the National Security Council. I was stunned by his ignorance
Hmm.
about the history of the Senkakus, and to include Okinawa too. But um, so I am holding out hope. I know the commentary has gotten a lot of attention in Japan,
Hmm.
including Okinawa, uh, with the U.S. military down there, with what's called Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii at Camp Smith, and back in D.C. So if that translates into a quick decision in the remaining 5 weeks of the Biden administration, or if it's homework for the Trump administration, but um, but um, whether it demonstrates Japanese sovereignty or not, um, from a U.S. perspective, that could be a topic of discussion. At the minimum, it's a reassertion of U.S. rights to the facilities that are guaranteed under the SOFA, and that at the minimum should be the principle that the U.S. pursues it. Um, Japan could then use that position to say, yeah, and that further demonstrates our claims to the islands or our administrative rights to the islands. At the minimum, it would serve as greater deterrence against an increasingly belligerent China in the area.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, like I love getting to do this podcast because like I can get people like you on and like explain everything about like these super important topics. Like it's like, okay, here's 45 minutes. Tell me all about it. You just did that. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Oh, that's amazing. So okay, of course there's the article. I will include the link to the article and the book you mentioned. Can you tell us the very amazing title of the book again?
Ah, so
That's
it's the
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it's the origins of U.S. policy in the East China Sea Islands dispute.
Link down below
Right. Um,
for anybody that
but
wants to know even
basically,
more.
yeah, basically the main argument
Yeah,
or main discussion of the book or the main
yeah,
purpose is to show that the U.S. had recognized the Senkakus as
right,
part of Japan, but at the time of the reversion agreement, the U.S. got flaky,
right.
and we we harmed a relationship with an important ally, Japan, by flaking out like we did.
Yeah,
And in the end, it's going to come back and kick a or bite us in the derriere.
yeah,
So, um,
yeah.
so I am very critical of the U.S. decision at that time,
Mhm.
because we created either some people would say intentionally. I don't believe that, but we created unintentionally a vacuum, and uh, we created a problem in the region that could have been, I don't, not even solved. It would have been non-existent
Yeah. Wouldn't have
if
happened.
in, yeah, if in 1972 we had included, in all the proper statements uh, that the Senkakus were, part of Japan. So we didn't do that, and we own to a large extent any problems that emerge from that. Obviously, China does too. Also, I argue that Japan does because it didn't immediately do everything it could to demonstrate effective control. So everybody's at fault here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but um, but the U.S. is also at fault, is my argument in the book.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, this is super interesting and a very important topic. It's one that, like I said before, it's one that comes up often. So I don't know, whenever it comes up in the headlines, I'll just share this on social media and go like, hey, listen to this and you'll understand the whole thing.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to mention? I mean, like we said, there's always more to talk about, but in case there's anything else you want to let readers or listeners know about, you can do that now.
Mm. Um, so we're recording this when I'm still in Taiwan,
Hmm.
and I'll be departing Taiwan at the end of December
Hmm.
after 1 year here. But part of my research is focused on Taiwan-Japan relations. And so it's been really eye-opening. Much of my relationship with Taiwan has been through Japanese eyes. So
Hmm.
I've done a lot with Japanese people uh, visiting Taiwan together or interacting with Japanese here in Taiwan. So maybe in the future we could talk
Yes.
about,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
yeah, Japan-Taiwan relations.
Yes. I'm looking forward to that one. So expect fourth appearance, everybody.
Okay,
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eldridge. I really
thank you.
appreciate it. It was wonderful getting to talk to you again.
Great. Thank you very much.